Hi there, and happy Girls in Aviation Day. Welcome to my workshop on careers in aviation with a COVID-19 outlook. My name is Shaesta Waiz, and I'm the founder and president of the nonprofit called Dream Soar. In 2017, I completed a global flight around the world to inspire the next generation of STEM and aviation professionals. Upon completing this flight, I became the youngest woman to fly solo around the world in a single-engine aircraft. For the next hour and a half, I invite you to be my co-pilot as we go around the world to the 22 countries that I visited on the flight and explore the careers in aviation that I encountered along the way, answer some fun trivia questions, and relive some of the flying adventures that I encountered around the world. 145 days after I took off to fly around the world, flying close to 25,000 nautical miles across 5 continents, landing in 30 airports, I safely landed at my home base airport in Daytona Beach, Florida, setting an aviation world record and inspiring many to consider careers in STEM and aviation. On the flight, we reached over 3,000 kids around the world through the several outreach events that were hosted along the way. In addition, we've reached a total of 12,000 children through our post-outreach efforts. Earlier this year, before the pandemic reached the United States, Dream Soar awarded our first flight scholarship to a young woman attending Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University, my alma mater. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, things have definitely slowed down for Dream Soar. As I'm sure you are aware, the whole world has been impacted, especially the commercial aviation industry. Now more than ever, it is important to stay positive. If you have a passion for aviation, you will find your purpose regardless of the challenges that you may be facing. To remind us of this point, let's look back at the aviation pioneers who had their own set of challenges, but because of their passions, they soared. The legendary Bessie Coleman, the first woman of African American descent and of Native American descent to hold a pilot's license. The first licensed Arab and African woman to fly a plane was Egypt's very own Latifa El Nadi. Hanadi Al-Hindi was the first Saudi woman to gain a commercial pilot's license back in 2005. This was during a time where women in Saudi Arabia were not even legally able to drive. Jacqueline Cochran, founder of the brave Women Air Force Service pilot, also known as the WASP. And finally, Jerry Mock, the housewife and mother from Ohio, who became the first woman to fly solo around the world in 1964. Aside from being a woman, they all had to overcome big challenges. These challenges were unique for each and every one of them. Our generation is faced with a unique challenge as well. COVID-19 is changing the way we live, socialize, and even the way that we are working. Just like the women broke barriers and defined norms before us, so will we. This pandemic might prove to be one of the biggest struggles of our generation, but even then, just like the women before us who succeeded and made history, we will too. Before we get started, be sure to access the characteristic activity worksheet and follow along. Throughout this presentation, you will notice that there are characteristics listed for each career that is featured. Utilizing the worksheet provided, compare your core characteristics with each of the career to see if there's a common link. If you do find that there's a connection, take the opportunity and explore and learn more about these careers. In order that you see on the screen, some of the careers that we're going to be talking about today is aviation attorney, International Civil Aviation Organization, also known as ICAO diplomats, charter pilot, air traffic controllers, aviation journalists, airport management, in-flight catering, flight dispatch, aviation insurance, Medevac pilots, airframe and power plant mechanics, also known as A&P mechanics, and FBOs, which stands for fixed base operators. We have a big list, lots of exciting stories, lots of exciting careers to discover, so let's get started. On May 13th, 2017, I took off from Daytona Beach, Florida, flying north of a distance of 650 nautical miles to Columbus, Ohio. The flight time was not too bad. It was only about 5 hours long. When I landed in Columbus, Ohio, there were a couple of really special people waiting for me there. When you look at the screen, the woman who's pictured at the picture towards your left, that's Susan Reed. Susan is the younger sister of Jerry Mock. And I mentioned Jerry earlier in this presentation. So Jerry is the housewife and mother from Columbus, Ohio, who was the first woman to successfully fly solo around the world back in 1964. And before Jerry passed away, I had the opportunity to kind of sit down with her and get to know her a little bit better. And after I shared my aspirations with Jerry, she was just so warm and had nothing but very positive things to tell me. She shared a lot of fun stories with me, some very scary moments when she flew around the world with me. But throughout the whole time, she came off as very confident that I was going to do this, that I was going to fly around the world. And that gave me so much confidence to believe in myself and my aspirations. And so with Jerry's mentorship, I really wanted to acknowledge her in some way. So we dedicated the first leg of the flight to Jerry's hometown of Columbus, Ohio. And Susan, Jerry's younger sister, as well as several members of Jerry's family, was there to welcome me when I landed in Columbus. When you look at the picture in the middle, where I'm standing next to two gentlemen, one on each side, the gentleman to the right in the khaki shorts, his name is Adrian Eichhorn, and Adrian is a pilot for JetBlue. In 2016, Adrian flew the same type of aircraft, a Beechcraft Bonanza, around the world and set a world record. The gentleman on the left, Adam Broom, he's the gentleman with the long pants. He is also a pilot. He flew around the world in 2016 as well in his Bonanza. And Adam is an aviation attorney. And by spending time with these two past Earth Rounders, I've got to know them a little bit better. Especially Adam, who shared with me that although he's very passionate about aviation, his career as an aviation attorney allows him to practice law, and then he still has his passion of flying. So the two are very linked, but they're separate in their own way. So an aviation attorney specializes in aviation laws and regulations. This may include operations of aircraft, maintenance of airports and aviation facilities, as well as any injuries that may occur on an aircraft at an aviation facility or as a result of an aviation accident. To be an aviation attorney, some of the characteristics that are required is for someone to be confident, someone to think critically, for someone to be very thoughtful, for someone to be articulate, especially if you're going to court, and someone to be very perceptive. So these are just a couple of the characteristics that are required of an aviation attorney. And then if you look at the last picture on the right, you could barely make out the Bonanza on the far left corner. So when I took off to go to my next destination, Adam and Adrian, they jumped into their aircraft and their Bonanzas, and the three of us flew in formation over the airport. We did a flyby. And after we flew over the runway, I went to my next destination, and the two pilots went off on their own way to go back home. And the whole formation flight was very symbolic because, here are these two past Earth Rounders kind of passing down the torch. to me who, I was getting ready to go around the world. This whole stop was just so special, so memorable. I felt Jerry's spirit there, and to have these two Earth Rounders come out and show their love and support really just set the tone for the flight. And I couldn't have asked for a better first leg of the flight. So are you ready for some aviation trivia, also known as Triviation? So in what year did McGill Law alumna Annie MacDonald Lagstaff become the first woman in Quebec to earn a degree in law? Was it in 1905, 1914, 1925, or 1934? So give it a good thought. How many years back did the first woman become a lawyer? Ready for the answer? The answer is 1914, so close to well over 100 years ago. Annie became the first woman in Quebec to earn her law degree. So some fun facts about Annie. Although she was an attorney, she was also an aviator. And she would typically present her profession that she was an aviator first before she was an attorney. Annie was also very big on ending women's suffrage. She was an activist, and she was also a great advocate to get women to become pilots. Lagstaff enrolled at McGill University in 1911, and it only took her 3 years for her to earn her bachelor's degree in civil law. So that's a little bit about Annie MacDonald Lagstaff. So going back to the flight, I took off from Columbus, Ohio, and I was en route to Montreal, Canada. It was a total of about 4 hours traveling a distance over 500 nautical miles. The reason why this stop was so exciting is because it was the first international stop. So I actually crossed the US border into Canada. And for some reason, the whole trip just became even more real to me. At that point, I had left the United States, entering my first international country, and I started to feel really good about making my way around the world. When I landed in Montreal, I had the opportunity to go visit ICAO. ICAO stands for the International Civil Aviation Organization, and ICAO's headquarters is in Montreal, Canada. So ICAO is part of the United Nations, the UN, and they regulate aviation around the world. They manage the safety, security, efficiency of aviation, and even work on environmental matters that are a result of commercial aircraft. ICAO is made up of representatives from each country that work together to come up with best aviation practices. These country representatives are called diplomats. Some of the characteristics that are required to be a diplomat is to have great understanding, to be insightful, and especially respectful towards all the different cultures and norms and languages that are out there in the world. A diplomat should be focused, and of course, a diplomat should be diplomatic. That's where the word diplomat comes from. When you look at the picture in the middle, standing inside the hangar at the Montreal Trudeau Airport, you have the aircraft behind us, and you have several members of the ICAO representatives as well as myself pictured here. And when I landed in Montreal, a lot of these representatives greeted me. And some of the representatives that are photographed in this picture are ones whose country that I was going to be going to during this around the world flight. So it was great to get these diplomats out to the airport, for me to shake their hand, and for us to talk about what to expect when I visit their countries. When you look at the picture to the left, standing with me is Angela Giddens. She is the Director General for the Airport Council International. So for short, they call that ACI. And Angela has been quoted to be the voice of airports from around the world. She has a very important job ensuring that all the airports around the world are up to standard, that they're running as efficiently and as safely as possible, and that everyone's communicating with one another. Angela and the ACI work very close with ICAO, and during my stop in Montreal, ACI, several other prominent aviation organizations like Iowa and IATA partnered with ICAO to hold a women's reception in my honor. And it was just great to be there to talk to Angela, get her insights about airports around the world, and to meet just such a strong, prominent woman in aviation. Overall, it was an opportunity for me to really get to know some of these representatives, some of these diplomats, for me to meet with ICAO representatives, and I thought that this would be a really good opportunity to talk about careers within the ICAO organization. So on to some more triviation. There are 195 recognized countries in the world. How many of them are a part of ICAO and the UN? Is it 111, 157, 193, or all 195? Take a moment to think about it. The answer is 193. So out of 195, 193 are part of the ICAO and the United Nations. I thought that that was pretty neat. Moving along, from Montreal, Canada, I had a very short flight to Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada. The flight was about 3 hours long, traveling a total distance of 430 nautical miles. When I landed at the Halifax airport, the one question that people would ask me was, have you met Debbie? I can't tell you how many times people have asked me, have I met Debbie? And I finally had the chance to meet Debbie, who is a charter pilot. And she flies a very unique charter operation. So first, let's talk about what a charter pilot is. Air charter is the business of renting an entire aircraft as opposed to an individual aircraft seat, like you typically do when you book a ticket on to travel with the airliners. And another way of thinking of it, it's like taking a personal Uber versus having a seat on a bus. Pilots who fly air charters usually fly to different locations, most often to locations that the airliners do not fly, which is decided ultimately by the paying customer. So Debbie, who's photographed in the picture that you see in the center, in the middle, she has a really unique operation where she flies to this island called Sable Island. And this island is off the coast of Halifax, Canada, in the Atlantic Ocean. It's a very small island, and there's not a lot of people living there. The people that do live there, they're really there just to help preserve the island and the animals that are in this island. And some of the animals include horses, wild horses. They've counted, I think, close to 500 wild horses on this island, which is just so unique. So for those who want to travel to Sable Island, they typically fly with Debbie from Halifax, Nova Scotia. The island is about 180 miles into the Atlantic Ocean, flying easterly, and 180 miles is about 300 kilometers. So when I met Debbie and she talked about her charter flights, I thought, this would be a great opportunity to highlight what Debbie does and talk about charter operations. When I was in Halifax, I was actually delayed for a week due to the weather over the Atlantic Ocean. For someone who's flying such a small airplane across this massive ocean, I needed to make sure that the weather was fair, that the winds were in my favor, and that for the most part there were no storms or any convective activity going on over the ocean. So to ensure that I got the best weather, I was actually delayed for a week, and I figured, why not go and take a look at Canada's or Halifax's major landmarks, and Peggy's Cove Inlet is one of those landmarks. And when you look at the picture on the right, that's a snapshot that I took of the Atlantic Ocean, and it was just such a surreal moment when I saw and I heard the waves crashing against the rocks. It just gave me this perspective that this ocean is alive and it's massive and it has a mind of its own. And I had so much respect for this ocean and for all the people who had traveled across this ocean. And it just really put things into perspective for me. And at the same time, I was excited to go on this journey across the ocean. So a couple of characteristics for a charter pilot is they have to be somewhat adventurous because they are flying to locations. Not all locations are these remote islands, but they are flying to locations that the airlines typically don't fly to. And sometimes they do fly to locations that the airliners fly to. It all really depends on the paying customer. It's important for a charter pilot to be flexible because, like for example, Debbie, if there are storms or activity going on in the Atlantic Ocean, they might not be able to take off, and you have to kind of make decisions at the last moment. It's important for charter pilots to be dedicated, to be energetic, and of course to be independent. So now for the Atlantic crossing. I took off from Halifax, Nova Scotia, flew a couple hours into the flight, had to turn around and do a landing in St. Pierre and Miquelon Airport, which is a small island that is French territory. From there, I had to then fly over to St. John's, Newfoundland. So what happened? Well, when I took off from Halifax, a couple hours into the flight, my HF radio, which stands for high frequency radio, that's the type of radio equipment that pilots use when they're flying across very remote parts of the world where there isn't a lot of reception. And you use your HF radio, which basically when you make a radio call, that radio call jumps into the ionosphere and then bounces back to about 12 to 13 towers that are spread around the world. And when it's relays to the tower, then there are controllers around the world that monitor these frequencies and they respond to you accordingly. So it's a bit kind of dinosaur age technology, but it works, and that's how pilots who fly around the world communicate with each other, or at least with air traffic control. And most times, even airliners, they have to use HF radio, but they have a lot more sophisticated equipment. So anyways, for this HF radio to work in my aircraft, there was an antenna that was on the exterior of the aircraft. So it was a big triangle. The attachment went from my side pilot window, the antenna went out to my wing, and then another part of it was connected to the tail, and then back to where it was connected to my side window. So it was a big triangle that was just dangling off of the aircraft. And when I was flying along, the antenna snapped off. Parts of it slammed into the aircraft, and I basically had no radio communications until I reached St. Pierre, Miquelon, and that airspace. And when I landed in St. Pierre, it was such a relief. It was, this really scary moment over the Atlantic Ocean. And when I landed there, I was told that there really isn't a lot of mechanical support to put this antenna back together, and that my best option was to fly to a nearby airport in Canada called St. John's in Newfoundland. And that's what I did. And so when I landed in St. John's, Newfoundland, that's where I encountered what an avionic technician, what they do. And I had an idea of what an avionics technician did, because we learn a lot about avionics as you're going through flight training. But being stuck in St. John's with this HF failure, it just gave me such an appreciation to all of the avionics and the mechanics that are out there in the world. So if you look at the middle picture, that's pretty much what the antenna looked like when I landed in St. Pierre. It was just ripped into pieces. This antenna is typically 28-foot cable that, again, just kind of was connected on the exterior of the aircraft. And just to see it in pieces, just like the wiring shredded, it just, what was going through my mind is, wow, this antenna could have wrapped around my flight controls. God forbid it interfere with the propeller. Anything could have happened. And I was just so grateful that I landed safely. When you look at the picture to the left, that's where the connector was from the side pilot window. That's where it was connected. And as you can see, obviously that antenna came off, and that picture is what it looked like once I was on the ground. And then the third picture is me landing in St. Pierre Airport, and apparently there are 4 or 5 pictures out there. Someone was at the airport and they saw that I was coming in, and they took a couple of snapshots of me landing, and that's me landing at that airport in St. Pierre. And when I finally got to St. John's, Canada, now I have to remind you, I had already been delayed a week in Halifax. And in St. John's, I was delayed for an additional 2 weeks. So that really delayed everything that was planned for the global flight. And that's when I had to ensure that an avionics technician put this HF radio back together. So what is an avionics technician? So avionics is the science of electronics in an aircraft, which include communication and navigational systems. And of course, for me, my problem was the communication part of the systems of my aircraft. Avionic technicians are specialists who repair and maintain a plane's electronic instruments, such as radio communication equipment, radar systems, and navigational aids. As the use of digital technology increases, more time is spent maintaining these avionic systems. And as you think about just the progression of aircraft, all of the technology that's available, there is a need for more avionics technicians to maintain all of the airplanes that are out there in the world. Some of the characteristics that are needed for an avionics technician is for someone to be technical. There is a lot of technical aspects with understanding how these systems work and how they're connected to the aircraft. They have to be dependable. In my case, I needed to make sure that the avionics technician knew what they were doing, and that they were going to stick with the timeline that they gave me so that I can continue to go around the world as best as possible. They need to be accurate, curious, because sometimes these technicians might have this understanding that the problem is one thing, and as they kind of dig in, they come to find out that there's a whole set of new problems, or what they initially thought, what initially they thought was a problem really wasn't the problem, it's something else. So just that curiosity helps them become better technicians, and of course to be efficient. So that was my special St. John's stop. Very unexpected, but I got to spend 2 weeks there. I had the opportunity to kind of get to know St. John's a little bit better. It's really a gem, especially for aviation buffs like me. A lot of pilots who cross the Atlantic Ocean, they actually do take off from St. John's, Canada, because it is the most northeastern tip of North America. And so by going there, your time is shortened if you want to fly to the Azores, which is my next destination. So when everything was put together and my HF radio was working, I finally took off to cross the Atlantic Ocean. I took off from St. John's. I flew across the big blue ocean of a distance of about 1,370 nautical miles. In total, it was about a 9.5, 10-hour flight. And after so much silence and just, working my HF radio, when I finally got to Santa Maria, the Azores airspace, and when I heard the air traffic controller talk to me through my normal radios, it was just such a blessing to hear a voice that was clear and crisp and concise. And it was just like, wow, hallelujah, and I just had such an appreciation for air traffic controllers. So for my stop in Santa Maria, I want to highlight air traffic controllers, just because I had that very powerful moment in the airplane when I heard Santa Maria controllers talking to me. So what is an air traffic controller? Well, air traffic controller, which is also known as ATC, helps prevent collision, organizes the flow of air traffic in airplanes in the sky, and provide information to both to controlled and uncontrolled airspaces for pilots. They basically tell the pilots where to go to ensure safety in the airspace above us. Some of the characteristics for an effective air traffic controller is that they need to be organized because there's a lot of traffic flying above. They need to be efficient, systematic, collected, especially for moments of distress or high air traffic flow, and to be flexible. If you look at the three pictures that I have shared with you all, the middle picture is when I landed in Santa Maria. It was the next day because I actually landed really late at night. The next morning I went out to the plane to do my inspection, and there was a group of women in aviation who came out to say hello, and one of the women was an air traffic controller. So it was great to meet her, and you can see the control tower right behind me in the photo behind the aircraft. So I thought that was a neat picture to show you all. The picture to my left, that's me. You can kind of see the antenna where it was connected to my side window, and then where it's connected to the wingtip. But that was the Atlantic Ocean. It was just such a beautiful flight. Nothing major happened. No scary moments. So I just wanted to show you a screenshot of what the Atlantic Ocean looked like me for a period during that flight. And then I got my air traffic control clearances, and I took off from Santa Maria to go to my next destination, which is Madrid, Spain. All right, so it's time again for some triviation. In what year did Francine James, the first Black woman from Ithaca, New York, become an air traffic controller? Was it in 1977, 1987, or 1997? So think back to when possibly the first Black woman officially became an air traffic controller. And the answer is in 1977. And when Francine became an air traffic controller, the newspaper headlines read, "High school dropout, she'll rule the skies." Because actually, Francine did drop out of high school, and she took on a job at the airport, and later realized that there's a career out there, such as an air traffic controller, and she studied for it, and she officially became an air traffic controller in 1977. You could definitely read a lot about Francine if you Google her name, and there's a couple of interviews on YouTube where she talks about how her career at becoming an air traffic controller back in the 1970s. All right, so when I took off from Santa Maria, the Azores, I flew the second part of the Atlantic Ocean, flying over Portugal to Madrid, Spain. The airport that I landed in is very close to Madrid International Airport. The airport that I landed in is called Cuatro Vientos, and it's actually the very first airport ever in Spain So there's a lot of rich history there. And during my stop, I had the opportunity to meet an aviation journalist, as well as go and tour where these aviation journalists work at and what their setup looks like at their headquarters. So, what is an aviation journalist? Really, aviation journalism is for people who enjoy writing, journaling, or reporting. There is a whole sector in aviation that is dedicated to informing the public about everything that's going on in the industry. So if you enjoy, writing and telling a story, this might be a career choice for you, where you can still be around aircraft and be the first to announce really exciting news that's going on. People who work for the aviation communications and publication sector are often on the front line of exciting news. They often attend air shows, such as EAA Oshkosh, the Dubai Air Show, and they interview important people like CEOs and astronauts and pilots, and hear about their daring stories. Some of the characteristics for an aviation journalist include someone who's curious. That curiosity is really going to get you a great story if you ask the right questions. Someone who's very observant, definitely a storyteller, and someone who is inquisitive to ask those questions that really make a great interview or a great article. If you look at the three pictures that I've provided, the picture in the middle, that is the headquarters that I went to with the journalists who are in aviation. SEPLA is the Spanish Airline Union organization. And so the Spanish Airline Union organization, they put out a magazine that just talks about everything that's going on in Spain and around the world that's related to flying. And they invited me to their headquarters to do an interview, and I was just so blown away at how many staff it requires to operate a publication such as SEPLA does. So I spent a couple of hours doing the interview, and then I went around to meet everybody that was on the team, and we took this group picture of myself and a couple of members of the team. But it was really neat just to see where it all happens. To the picture on the left, photographed with me is a young woman by the name of Almudena. And I initially met Almudena. She was my host during my stop in Madrid. So she was the one taking me around and making sure that I got to my events and that I was on time, and I kind of navigated myself around the city. So when I met Almudena, she just had this dying desire to become a pilot. And after I had spent some time with her and really, opened her eyes to about the power of dreaming and believing in yourself and just understanding that life is so short, taking that leap to become a pilot is really not as difficult as she originally had thought that it would be. And so after spending some time with her, she decided to have a complete career shift. So now Almudena's, within the last 3 years, she obtained her private pilot's license in Madrid, as well as her instrument rating, and she's well on her way to completing her commercial license. And she aspires to be an airline pilot, which I just wanted to highlight that story because I think that should be aviation journalism. Just news about people making that leap into aviation. And it's not as far, as such a far reach as some people believe that it is. And then finally, the picture to the right, that's just me as I was flying from the Azores towards Spain. As I reached the Portugal coast, I decided to take this snapshot. I mean, it was just beautiful. This part of the world, the water, the landscape, the mountains. I mean, it just all was very magical. All right, so some more triviation for you. Did you know that there's approximately 170 in-flight magazines around the world for commercial airlines? Can you match the in-flight magazine titles below with the airline that it belongs to? So the list that you have to your left, that's just a list of all the a list of 5 different airlines, and the list to the right is a list of in-flight magazines. If you can match the airline with the in-flight magazine title, I'll give you just a couple of seconds to kind of see if you can guess and match the airline to the in-flight magazine. All right, let's see how you've done. So Cathay Pacific, their in-flight magazine is called Discovery. United Airlines in Hemisphere is their in-flight magazine title. Kenya Airways, Safari. Ryanair, Let's Go Magazine. And finally, Turkish Airlines. Their in-flight magazine is titled Skylife. What I think is so interesting about this triviation is that there are 170 in-flight magazines out there around the world. So that means that there's just such a demand for content and journalism, and just to be able to, for these airliners to connect with their customers. You know, there's just such a need for journalism. And the commercial airline industry is such a small sector compared to the industry as a whole. So it's just a little taste of what the need for aviation journalism is when you look at the industry as a whole. All right, moving along to the next leg of the flight. So from Madrid, Spain, I flew to a very small island in Italy. It's actually in the region of Sardinia, Italy, called Calgary. And while my stop in Italy, I had the opportunity to land and meet the airport staff, who were there, very well organized, ready to receive me. As soon as I landed, I shut the engine off, and it was like, here's your fuel. Can we take your trash away? What can we get for you? Here's a bottle of water. And it had seemed like they had planned out a really precise schedule to take me from the aircraft and transport me to the terminal, where there were several aviation journalists there to interview me. And everything was just so well planned out. And later on, I met with the airport manager who came to greet me, and he said that his staff had been working for quite some time on my arrival to make sure that the journalists would be there, that the local news would capture the arrival, and that the staff were fully prepared for me coming into land. So what is an airport manager exactly? An airport manager ensures that the airport is operating efficiently and safely. They make sure people are moving in the right direction. They usually have duties both in the office and outside on the air side. Here's a list of responsibilities. So airport managers manage various airline terminals and concourses, oversee retail operations such as the shops and restaurants that you typically enjoy when you go to an airport. They assist in preparing annual budgets for airport operations. They ensure that the runway and taxiways are open, clear, and safe for air traffic to land and take off on. And finally, they communicate with the air traffic controllers, with the tower, to just let them know of what's going on in the airport environment. To be an effective airport manager, it's important to be a leader as you are managing an entire airport. Planning is essential, especially with the budgets and just scheduling throughout the year. Being organized is another characteristic, as well as responsibility and being able to communicate effectively. The picture that you see in the center, that's me with the airport team that greeted me once I arrived. The picture to the left, that's actually my Garmin G530 Avionics that showed my track as I was leaving Spain, flying towards Sardinia. And then finally, the picture to the right, that's a snapshot of my GoPro that was on, of me coming into land on this very small but very beautiful island. And so this was an opportunity for me to really highlight what an airport manager does. And if you enjoy being both around aircraft and in that environment and also enjoy an office job, this might be a career that you could look into. Moving along from Cagliari, Italy, over to my next stop, which is Athens, Greece. This was a very scenic flight. Just, again, beautiful seas, beautiful sceneries. This is just such a beautiful part of the world. And to be flying in this region, it was just so surreal for me. The total flight time from Italy to Greece was about 5 hours. The distance was 700 nautical miles. And the picture that I want to show you and share with you. So the picture to the left is my approach into Athens. Athens, when you're flying into Athens, there's lots of beautiful mountains. And this was the first time that I really kind of encountered, dark clouds, some rain, some hail. So the weather wasn't necessarily blue skies and pretty sunshine. So this was another screenshot from my GoPro that I wanted to share with you. But the mountains were just stunning. And the picture that you see to the right, that's me kind of rolling with the big jets. This is when I landed in Athens. And when I was kind of navigating my way around the airport, all of these big jets, you just saw the people who were sitting in the flight deck as I was this little bonanza kind of rolling with these big aircraft. You would just see the heads turning in my direction, like, who is this person? What are they doing? Because they don't typically see such small aircraft in such a big international airport. So I figured I'd share these pictures with you from my stop from Greece. Moving along, the next leg of the flight was from Athens to Cairo, Egypt. And this was the first time I had ever gone to the continent of Africa. And Egypt was just such a beautiful memory when I think back and I look back on it. And even the flight, the total flight time was about 4.5 hours, a distance of 600 nautical miles. And when I landed in Cairo, after I landed, one of the first things that the people at the airport had asked me was, "What is your meal request?" How often do people ask you that? I think that's like one of my favorite questions ever in the world. And throughout the flight, Air Culinaire, which is an in-flight catering company, they were our partners in the global flight around the world. They were providing meals for me along the way. And it was just one less thing that I had to worry about, is where can I find food that is easy on the stomach, that is relatively safe to eat, and that's not going to hurt my stomach while I'm flying these long flights. And sure enough, Air Culinaire provided these really delicious meals along most of the stops around the world. The picture that you see in the middle, that's just an example of one of the meals that I had. What you see there is slices of cheese, some grapes, some olives, and some nuts. I don't typically eat this fancy, and it was just so nice to get these cool meals delivered every time I would take off to go to my next flight. And in this stop, I want to highlight the career field of in-flight catering. In-flight catering companies around the world provide passengers with quality food and beverages. Depending on the country or region, some in-flight catering considerations include dietary restrictions. For example, for countries in the Middle East, like Egypt, and others that I'm going to be visiting here with you all very shortly, Catering with the halal certification is expected, which includes no pork products and according to the religious customs. The food types can range from simple snacks, like what you typically buy on an economy short haul, which means short distance flight, to even a 5-course meal on a first class lounge for the longer haul flights. In-flight catering is in demand for aircraft all over the world, especially private jets that are flying as well as commercial airline flights. So in-flight catering, it's a very big industry that's serving both the commercial and the private sectors. And some of the characteristics that are needed for someone to work in this field is for someone to be articulate, logical, creative, especially with the meals, friendly, and considerate, especially with all of the dietary restrictions that are out there. And then the picture to the right, that's me with the Egyptian pyramids, which the pyramids, when you see them in person, it's so magical. And as I was standing in front of these beautiful historic pyramids, I couldn't help but think just how much of STEM went into building these pyramids, the science, the technology, the engineering, and mathematics. Oftentimes people think STEM, it's a new term, but STEM really has been there from the beginning of time and used differently throughout different periods of our history. And so it really made the whole pyramid experience, it just made me more grateful to be there and just eye-opening. So I'm very grateful that I had the chance to see the pyramids and to have a stop in Africa. So, are you ready for more triviation? According to Condé Nast, best meal in the sky, can you guess the most popular meal for each airline below? Take just a few seconds here and see if you can match up the airline with the best meal that they provide to their passengers. All right, let's see how you do. So for Austrian Airlines and their business class cabin, they are most popular for their coffee service, which I'm really curious because I'm a big coffee junkie. I'm curious to know what their coffee tastes like. For Alaska Airlines, their first class cabin, they are most popular for their breakfast granola. Hawaiian Airlines, first class, they're known for their beef tartare. And ANA business class, they're known for their, and I hope I say this correctly, teriyaki. Finally, Cathay Pacific, they are known for their Mandarin Oriental roasted chicken, which all sounds super delicious. But I hope you appreciate this triviation. I'm a big foodie, and I thought it went well with the in-flight catering career that was just featured. Moving on with the flight. So from Cairo, Egypt, I took off and I flew across the entire country of Saudi Arabia, which was mostly lots of sand, lots of desert land. The flight time from Cairo to Bahrain, which was my destination, flight time was about 7.5 hours, with the distance just over 1,000 nautical miles. When I landed in Bahrain, if you know anything about Bahrain, it's actually an island country. So it's surrounded by water, and the waters are really calm and beautiful. If you look at the picture to the left, that's a screenshot that I captured on my GoPro of me getting ready for my approach into Bahrain. And while I was in Bahrain, I actually was nearing my 30th birthday. So the Intercontinental Hotel, which is the hotel that I stayed at, it was very close to the airport. They prepared this beautiful, delicious cake that said, "Welcome, Captain Shaesta Waiz, the world is yours." So I thought that was so sweet that I landed in this beautiful island country and they prepared this very delicious cake just for me to eat, which I thought was really neat. I was only in Bahrain for one night. I had to get the aircraft ready, and fly from Bahrain to Dubai in the United Arab Emirates. So I flew across the Arabian Gulf, and when I got to Dubai, I had the chance to go to Hadid's headquarters. Hadid is the flight planning company that supported all of the trip planning and flight dispatching for the global flight. So trip support and flight planning companies offer a wide range of services to their clients. Some of these services include flight crew briefings, ATC, which stands for air traffic control filings, route planning, and flight monitoring. These services are usually completed by a flight dispatcher. A flight dispatcher assists in planning flights for aircraft. Here are some of the considerations that they take when they are dispatching a flight. The first one is aircraft performance and loading. So a dispatcher needs to understand the aircraft, the performance, the limitations, so that they can determine what would be the most efficient and optimum route based on the speed of the aircraft and what the weight of the aircraft is, and just understanding the aircraft performance. The second is en route weather, thunderstorms, and turbulence forecast. So for example, an aircraft like mine, which is a single engine, 6-seater Beechcraft Bonanza, I really can't fly in the high flight levels that big airliners and big jets do. So I had to be very wary of thunderstorms, any sort of turbulence, any sort of adverse weather en route. And that's something that Hadid had helped me throughout the flight, the global flight. Airspace restrictions, airport conditions, flight following services, and advise pilots if any conditions change. For a flight like mine, where I would take off really early in the morning, by the time I would get close to my destination, it would be completely dark, and sometimes the airport would have changes that the flight dispatcher would communicate with me. Some of the characteristics that are important for a flight dispatcher includes being a multitasker, being an effective communicator, thinking very logistically because things kind of change at the last minute, being very detail-oriented, as well as being dependable. For some of these flights, where it might be single pilot operations like me, the flight dispatcher is kind of like your co-pilot on the ground. If you look at the picture that's in the center, that's at the Hadid headquarters in Dubai. So our team, the Dream Soar team, met up with me in Dubai, and we got to go to the Hadid headquarters and just kind of meet everybody and just see the behind the scenes, this dispatch room and so on. If you look at the picture to the left, so this is a screenshot of what the weather was looking like from Oman to India. And as you can see, there's lots of weather, lots of thunderstorms. And at this point of the flight, we were able to bring a company called Universal Weather, who also does trip planning and flight support. Universal Weather has had experience with dispatching a small aircraft like mine, and they have a whole meteorology department dedicated to their customers. So Universal Weather came on board to help with some of the weather briefings to make sure that I had the most accurate information as I continued my trip around the world, which we'll get into in just a little bit about some of the weather that I encountered. And then finally, the picture to the right, that's me with First Officer Bahita, who flies for Emirates Airlines. She's a first officer on the Boeing 777. And it was really neat. I had the opportunity to go to the Emirates Aviation College and fly their simulators with Bahita. And we had a chance to talk about our backgrounds and fly an approach into Mumbai. If you're curious, if you go onto YouTube and type in Dream Soar Simulator Challenge, Emirates Airlines, you can see the whole experience on YouTube, which was all prepared by Emirates Airlines. So one thing that we had to do due to insurance purposes was leave the aircraft in Dubai while I got on board a commercial flight and flew to Kabul, Afghanistan, the country that I'm originally from. And part of why we had to do this is because a lot of the risk assessments that came back had flagged that Afghanistan, because it's a war zone, it wasn't very safe for me to fly into. And because I absolutely wanted to go back to Afghanistan, especially because when I was just a young baby, my family had left the country as refugees. For me to go back as now a woman and a pilot who is on this around the world flight, it was very important for me to include Afghanistan along in the journey. But because of insurance reasons, I had to leave the aircraft behind, which safety was on the forefront of everything that we did. So if this is something that the insurance providers said that they think it's a big risk, I was more than happy to comply. And also get a little creative on how to include Afghanistan on the global flight. So the solution was to leave the aircraft in Dubai. I flew a commercial airliner. I landed in Afghanistan, and there were several events that was planned with the Afghani government as well as the United Nations. And when you look at the picture, you see me standing in the middle picture next to President Ashraf Ghani, who is the president of Afghanistan, and standing next to President Ashraf Ghani is my father, who at the time was working in the government in Kabul. So it was such a nice stop to go back and just, be with people who look like me and people who talk like me, and just hear my native language and see the mountains and, everything that my parents had talked about, within my 30 years of life. Their sweet memories or fondest memories of Afghanistan. It was so nice to go back and see it all for myself. The picture that you see to the left, that's me taking a selfie with the Afghan Air Force soldiers. So these are all women. They all aspire to be pilots, and they are in the Air Force. All of these pilots are waiting for a flight slot. The woman who's just directly behind me, kind of in the green flight suit, it might be difficult to see her, but she's standing right behind me. She is actually a pilot flying for the Air Force, which is really, really neat. I want to say within the last 10 years, they had allowed women to actually fly for the Air Force, which is a lot. I feel like that's coming a long way for a country like Afghanistan. So, as you would imagine, I learned a lot about aviation insurance with this stop, so I decided to highlight the career of an aviation insurance on this particular stop. And just like how you would need insurance for a car in case of an accident or an incident, aviation offers insurance to aircraft owners and operators. Aviation insurance is insurance coverage geared specifically to the operations of an aircraft and the risk involved in aviation. Aviation insurance brokers work with clients to determine the best insurance policy because some aircraft operate in different countries, some aircraft stay on the ground and are static, while other aircrafts are moving 24 hours a day. To be in aviation insurance, it's important to be a great researcher, just so that you are aware of, what are the risks, what all is out there, understanding a company, their profile, their flight operations. It's important to be assertive. Like our aviation insurance provider had said, it's a big risk for me to go to Afghanistan. And although this flight is very notable and the cause is notable, it's a safety factor. So I really appreciated the assertiveness and the honestness, which is the third characteristic. And finally, being detail-oriented, just making sure that these policies really best serve clients and their operations. Finally, if you look at the last picture, the picture on the right, while in Afghanistan, I was able to get my commercial pilot's license, my Afghani commercial pilot's license. And in the history of female pilots in Afghanistan, which there really aren't that many, I was the first Afghani woman to hold a commercial license. So to get my license presented to me was really nice. After spending a couple days in Afghanistan, I went back to Dubai, jumped in the airplane, and I took off to fly to my next destination, which was Muscat, Oman. The flight time was about an hour and a half and a total distance of about 200 nautical miles. And when I was flying across over to Oman, and when I entered Oman airspace, I just saw, again, a lot of beautiful open land. And a fun fact about Oman, Oman is the oldest independent state in the Arab world. So they have been there from the very beginning, very established. And depending on what part of Oman that you visit, it's very different. The route that I took flying over to Oman was lots of desert, but there are some very tropical and beachy, very scenic areas within the country. And I just wanted to share this picture with you of my flight flying over to Oman. From Oman, I really had the challenge ahead of me with regards to weather. So I took off from Muscat. I flew across to Mangalore, India. From there, I went down to Sri Lanka, flew over to Thailand. Then from Thailand, I went down to Singapore. From Singapore, I made my way over to Indonesia. And in this part of the world, I had just entered monsoon season. So if you know anything about monsoon, typically the weather is very heavy rain, low visibility, low ceilings, and the weather is just constantly changing. It's very difficult to really predict what's going to happen. And monsoon season usually is a season where the winds are changing. So with that, again, comes heavy rain, low ceilings, low visibility. And that's a challenge for an aircraft like mine that usually flies between anywhere from 7,000 feet up to 9,000, sometimes 10,000 feet. And a fun fact, Amelia Earhart was also stuck in India due to monsoon season. So it's very common for people who are flying in this region, small planes, to get stuck because of the weather. So some of the pictures that we have here today, the picture starting from the left, again, lots of cloud buildup. Underneath all that cloud, I mean, it was just thunderstorms, lots of rain, and luckily I was above the weather when I was flying around in this region. The center picture is me in Mangalore, India. There was nothing that I could do. I mean, I was just stuck. I had to wait for the weather to clear. The picture next to that one where I'm standing next to a woman, it was just so neat to meet a woman custom and immigration officer. And they greeted me with their, welcome, their traditional way of saying hello. And as I said hello back to her, I just kind of looked up and said, God, thank you for getting me this far along in the global flight and help me get through the rest of it with monsoon season. And then finally, the last picture, the picture to your very right, again, that's just what the ceilings look like, and it was very difficult for me to take off. So lots of delays again. So the video that you just saw is actually of me driving around the airport. The weather report had said that it was clear skies and scattered clouds at 3,000 feet. And sure enough, it looked like just like the darkest clouds you could imagine. And after I took this video, a heavy rain cloud came over and just soaked the airport. So again, weather is constantly changing in this part of the world. And although these weather reports come out, and they might be accurate for that moment, the weather is changing so quickly that the weather reports can't really keep up. Another story actually that I want to share with you that I haven't shared with many people is specifically my flight from Phuket, Thailand down to Singapore. So you see 3 pictures here. And when I took off from Phuket and I was en route to Singapore, I was flying by Kuala Lumpur. So I'm flying along, and sure enough, there's a huge cell that comes over with very intense thunderstorms over Kuala Lumpur. And before I know it, air traffic is directing flights, diverting flights, and the airspace becomes very quiet. To my right, a volcano erupts in Indonesia. So I have these 2 very scary Mother Nature phenomenons taking place while I'm in the middle, just flying along at about 9,000 feet en route to Singapore. And the first picture that you see to the left, that's kind of what I had seen when the thunderstorm came over Kuala Lumpur. And slowly, that little pocket of sunshine was becoming smaller and smaller. And the volcano on my right was just developing. The cloud, the smoke that was coming from the volcano. And as I kept progressing forward, that little ray of sunlight kept getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And I had to make a decision. What do I do? Do I turn back around and fly back to Phuket? That really wasn't an option because all of the thunderstorms and the clouds that I had dodged had now developed into very convective weather. And of course, I couldn't land to my left because of the thunderstorms in Kuala Lumpur, and I couldn't land to my right, which were all of these dark clouds from the volcano. So I just made the decision that I'm going to keep flying forward and that I'm going to make it. So you can see the progression, the middle picture of just like the dark clouds, and then finally, it just becomes very dark. And of course, there's a positive ending to the story. I did make it through the thunderstorms. And once I broke out of this weather, I wasn't in it for very long. It was nothing but beautiful skies. I landed in just perfect weather in Singapore, and I just kissed the ground, thanking God that I had made it through what I thought was just the most bizarre flight possible. From Indonesia, I made my way down to Australia, crossing the Intertropical Convergence Zone, the ITCZ. And if you know anything about the Intertropical Convergence Zone, it's really a belt of low pressure which circles the Earth, generally near the equator. And you just have these converging winds that cause all of these very extreme weathers. So typically around the equator, around the Intertropical Convergence Zone, you're going to see a lot of thunderstorms, a lot of buildup. And being in the small aircraft that I was in, it was very dramatic making my way from Indonesia down to Australia. But eventually I made it. Australia was a very fun country to land in. When I departed from Indonesia, actually what is required is for pilots to disinfect the aircraft with this aerosol called top of descent. And basically you spray it in the airplane to make sure that any sort of bugs or insects are not transferred into Australia. So I actually had to do that, and I actually had to calculate exactly when I would spray it, because you're supposed to spray it right before you start descending down into your destination airport in Australia. If you look at the middle picture, I had this adapter, and I finally was able to use the Australian plug. I always wondered, where is this plug? I made it well, halfway through around the world, and I haven't used this plug. And then I realized once I got to Australia that that's the Australian plug. And my stops in Australia was Darwin and Cairns. The picture that you see of me with the aircraft behind me, that's me landing in Cairns. And it was just really beautiful, lots of mountains, lots of greenery. So from Cairns, Australia, I flew then to New Caledonia. From New Caledonia over to Fiji. From Fiji, I made my way over to American Samoa. And from American Samoa, I flew up to Christmas Island in Kiribati. Then from Kiribati, I went up north to Honolulu, Hawaii. And this was my track across the South Pacific and the islands that I had visited. One of the stops that I want to talk about is Christmas Island in Kiribati. So Christmas Island is a part of the Republic of Kiribati. There are several islands that make up the Republic of Kiribati. The name comes from English navigator Captain James Cook, who sighted the island on Christmas Eve in 1777. When you look at the pictures, Kiribati is a very simple country. When I went to Customs and Immigration, it was literally this kind of like a screened porch-looking area where that's where I did the stamping of my passport. I did immigrations. I did customs there. I paid for my fees. I paid for the fuel. And it was all in this very small area that was screened off. And that the sign that you see was the official welcome sign to the country. The picture off to the right, that was the sign to the hotel, which is called the Captain Cook Hotel. So the Captain Cook Hotel used to be a former English army barracks, and once the English had left, the people of Kiribati turned that into their hotel. It was just an experience. It was very humbling to be there with the people of Kiribati. They're very warm, they're very welcoming, and it was quite the experience to be at a former British army barracks that was transformed into somewhat of a hotel. And then the picture that you see in the middle, that is the picture of when I was staying at the Captain Cook Hotel. I had actually met a woman pilot, Salote, who flies for Air Kiribati. And Salote flies several different operations, and one of the operations that she does quite often is Medevac operations. So medical evacuation, commonly referred to as Medevac, is the paramedics in the sky. A Medevac pilot ensures that medical personnel and or patients on the airplane are safely transported to their destination. Medevac pilots are especially in remote locations like the South Pacific. The characteristics that make up a Medevac pilot include being reactive, being reliable, being cooperative, sometimes being brave, as well as working under pressure. Because these islands are so far away from, major hospitals, the Medevac pilots have to be on call and be ready at a moment's notice to transport patients or go out and bring medical items back to the island. So Christmas Island, I just wanted to highlight the Medevac pilot career choice. If you're passionate about medicine, perhaps you could still fly and help the medical field. So for some triviation, did you know that in 1926 the United States Army Air Corps used a converted de Havilland aircraft to transport patients from Nicaragua to a France Army base in Panama, which was 150 miles away. This flight is the first Medevac flight recorded in history. Moving along to finishing off the Pacific Ocean during the route. So I took off from Honolulu, Hawaii. I flew for 14 and a half hours long, nonstop, over nothing but great bodies of ocean. And some people ask me, what ocean is tougher, the Atlantic or the Pacific? And for me, I prefer flying over the Pacific just because the weather is a bit more predictable, the waters and temperatures a bit warmer than the Atlantic. The biggest challenge is that if you do have an emergency during this trip from Honolulu to San Francisco and my type of aircraft, you aren't going to see land for, depending on where you are, for a very long time. And your only place to land in case of an emergency landing is in the ocean. So the night that I took off in the morning, and when I was getting closer to the San Francisco Bay Area, there was a very thick cloud layer right above me. And so I really didn't have a lot of perception to where the stars were, the moon, and just having that horizon of where the ocean was and where the sky was. So it was a bit nerve-wracking. I really had to focus on my flight instruments. And I can't tell you, when I saw the San Francisco skyline and when I saw the lights, I just had the biggest rush of happiness that came over me, happiness and relief. And on my GoPro camera, the picture to the left, that's just a screenshot of what I was seeing as I was approaching land. And just to see lights, it was just, I had to be careful. I wanted to just cry out of happiness and relief, but I had to really focus on my instruments and get my plane ready to land. So I landed in Hayward, California, which is considered the Bay Area of California. And it's very close to where I grew up. And it was really nice to just kind of go back where it all started for me, where I had spent most of my life up until when I went off to college. And the picture to the very right, that's me landing at the Hayward Airport, and my family was there to greet me. And while in Hayward, we took the aircraft in for it to get inspected by a mechanic, because as you would imagine, the last time a mechanic really inspected the aircraft was when I took off before the global flight in Daytona Beach, Florida. So mechanics in aviation are usually referred to airframe and power plant mechanics. They typically work in hangars, at or near the airport, or at a repair station. Mechanics usually work with their hands, and they work either both the day and the night shifts. So airframe, that's what the A stands for in A&P mechanic. Airframe is typically the body and structure of the aircraft and doesn't include the power plant, which are the engines, or the propeller or the avionics on board the aircraft. Power plant, which is the P in A&P mechanic, refers to the engines of the aircraft, which can consist of both piston, cylinder, and fan engines. The engine helps produce energy to propel the aircraft forward. Some of the characteristics that are required for an A&P mechanic is someone that's very detail-oriented, a problem solver, especially when there's something wrong with the aircraft. You really have to understand what you're working with, try to solve the problem. It's important to be organized, and most importantly, it's important to be responsible and be thorough when you're looking through the aircraft and working on either the airframe or the power plant. The picture that you see in the middle, that's the Bonanza completely taken apart by the A&P mechanic. And it was just great to be home and great for the aircraft to be serviced so that I can finish off the flight around the world. So I took off from Hayward, California, made my way over to Phoenix, Arizona, then to Austin, Texas, Louisiana. Then from Louisiana, I finally made it to Daytona Beach, Florida. I officially landed in Daytona on October 3rd of 2017. The whole trip took about 145 days long. Initially, I had planned for a 90-day trip, and it took 145 days, and that was due to all the delays that I had encountered with my HF radio and the weather around the world. And when I landed in Daytona Beach, Florida, the picture to the very right, this was me. There was a photographer waiting for my arrival who captured this picture. So you see my small plane in front of the very big Boeing 747. And as I came into land, I just remember looking off to my right and seeing NASA's big 747 aircraft just parked right at the airport. And I thought, wow, what's next? Is space next? Who knows? What's next for me after completing this flight around the world? But I just thought it was so cool to see that plane as I came into land. And sure enough, when I got out of the aircraft and I saw the Dream Soar team who had worked so hard on the planning and the preparation of the flight, I gave them all a big hug, and I went to the ground and I kissed the ground to say thank you for everybody who helped support this global flight, and a big thank you just for being back and being safe and have completed this dream that I had worked on for so many years. And the picture that you see in the middle, this was the very last picture that I took to kind of conclude the global flight, and that's me at the Shelter FBO, which stands for Fixed Base Operator. So this is where I typically would park the aircraft when I was in Daytona. And I snapped this picture before the aircraft went into its hangar. And that officially concluded the global flight. So a Fixed Base Operator, which is also known as an FBO, is a company that is given permission by the airport to operate on its own premises to provide aeronautical services for aircraft, passengers, and crew. Generally, FBOs are the main providers of services in general aviation or for private and recreational flying. So typically, FBOs provide anything from fuel to oil. Sometimes they contract maintenance. They park the aircraft in the hangar. They have stations set up inside the FBO where people can access weather, they can call and file flight plans. So it's an area where the flying community can go to and prepare for their departure. When you fly on a charter flight, you usually operate out of an FBO versus the general terminals where airline traffic operates out of. And to be within the FBO sector, it's important to be accommodating because you're welcoming and saying goodbye to so many people that are going through the FBO. It's important to be organized, logical, flexible, and friendly. So there are 3 additional careers that I just want to mention that I didn't encounter during the global flight, but I want to make sure that you all are aware. The first one is aerospace and space exploration. The second is drones, and drones are typically referred to unpiloted aircraft or even sometimes spacecrafts. They're often referred to as UAVs, unmanned aerial vehicles. And drones are typically used for aerial photography, shipping and delivery, disaster management. Some drones have thermal sensors on them so that they can detect
any sort of movement during search and rescue operations. And finally, drones are now being used to track storms and forecast any type of hurricane or tornadoes. And finally, urban air mobility. So urban air mobility is just in congested urban areas like New York and Los Angeles, Dubai and Mumbai. Urban air mobility refers to urban transportation systems that move people by air. And there's a lot of talk about having this form of transportation being either manned or unmanned, which is a really hot topic. So I just wanted to point these three career fields. Just if you are interested, be sure to check them out, do some research. But these are three careers that are growing, and I just wanted to make sure that I incorporated them in this presentation.
As we wrap up this presentation, I'd like to conclude with a very powerful quote by astronaut Mae Jemison. Mae Jemison says, "Don't let anyone rob you of your imagination, your creativity, or your curiosity. It's your place in the world, it's your life. Go on and do all that you can with it and make it the life you want to live." In context with what we're dealing with COVID-19, I feel like this quote really sends a very clear message that yes, we're dealing with a pandemic, but we can't allow this pandemic to rob us of our imagination, our creativity, and especially our curiosity. This is your place in the world. If you have a passion for aviation, you will find your purpose. Go out there and live the life you want to live. I hope that this presentation has inspired you and sparked your curiosity to all of the different career fields that are out there in the aviation industry. All of the careers that we just reviewed are showing, if not growth, stability in the aviation sector. Although the airline industry is dealing with kind of a downslope, with everything in aviation, it's very temporary. Air travel is essential to the world, and the airline industry will bounce back soon enough. And in the meantime, I hope that these careers can give you some sort of direction and just open up your eyes to what's really out there in the aviation industry. It's not just pilots and air traffic controllers and mechanics. It's really a whole world. And I feel like we've only scratched the surface through this presentation. If you like what you see, the experience continues at womensoargroup.com. Be sure to check us out to learn about other workshops that are offered and to learn about the workshop that you just participated in today. That really wraps up the presentation. I hope you all enjoyed this journey around the world. I thank you all for your participation. Thank you for coming along with me and allowing me to share my stories during the global flight around the world. Again, a very happy Girls in Aviation Day, and today's your day. Enjoy it and celebrate it. Thank you.
If you want to learn more about this presentation, as well as other presentations that we offer, visit us at womensoargroup.com. I know that we covered a lot today, but one thing that we were not able to include were exclusive interviews from women around the world who are in the career fields that we highlighted in this presentation. I encourage you all, visit our website and take a listen to what these women have to say about how COVID-19 has impacted their jobs and their characteristics from their point of view that best defines someone in their career field.